If you've ever heard tales of the famed knight known as Cahir, you'd be forgiven for thinking him a Nilfgaardian. After all, it's no secret that he was raised in the far reaches of the Empire. It should be clarified, however, that south of the Amel Mountains, such a title is only ever afforded to the indigenous inhabitants of the capital and those raised along the lower basin of the Alba River. And Cahir Mawr Dyffryn ap Ceallach hailed not from Nilfgaard proper, but from Vicovaro, a distinction that would come to mean a great deal. When Cahir was still just a boy, his older brother Ailill died fighting for the Empire in Nazaire. And in the Dyffryn family, it was a strictly held tradition that, when such tragedies occurred, the men would hold a silent vigil lasting a whole day and night over the body of their fallen relative, while the women, so as not to disrupt the men's reflections, would gather and weep in a separate wing of the family stronghold. Being only 10 years old at the time, little Cahir was not yet considered a man by Dyffryn standards, and thus, he was not allowed to sit in silence with his grandfather Griffith, his father Ceallach, or his brother Darin, nor the whole collection of uncles and cousins gathered around his brother's coffin. And being not a woman, neither was he permitted to sob alongside his mother Mar, his 3 sisters, or grandmother Aviva, nor the whole collection of aunts and cousins gathered in the cloister. Instead, Cahir ran about the castle with the rest of his young relatives, taking it upon himself to pummel any of them who dared claim that the bravest among the men fighting in Nazaire were their own fathers and brothers, and not Ailill. When Cahir was finally reunited with his heartbroken mother that day, she made him swear that he would never forget what the Northerners had done to his older brother. He was to forever hate them. It was an odd request, considering Ailill had died an honorable death in battle, and the fact that Cahir's grandmother had descended from Nordlings. But the boy simply couldn't forgive how much sorrow they had caused his mother. And so, he made her a promise that he would one day go to war with the Northerners and chop off their heads. And that he did. No older than 25, the Vicovaran had already proven himself a capable young man, even managing to earn the rank of officer in the Nilfgaardian intelligence service. It was the very reason he was eventually entrusted by Emperor Emir to find and capture the Cintran princess known as Cirilla during the First Northern War. Thanks to a spy in the Cintran court, Cahir learned that the Northerners planned to smuggle the girl out of town as Nilfgaard besieged the city. In part thanks to the spy's intel, and also a great deal of luck, the Blue-Eyed Knight managed to intercept the young lass as the capital went up in smoke. Soon after, the two found themselves at the river's edge, exhausted from all they had just been through. And not thinking clearly, Cahir allowed the both of them to fall asleep. A decision he would come to regret for a long time. You see, when the Vicovaran awoke, the princess was no longer there. With Ciri now out of reach, he had failed his mission. When Cahir returned empty-handed, his father, the Emperor's steward, begged for Emir's forgiveness. But a forgiving man the Emperor was not, and for 2 years, the boy wasted away in the dungeons of the now captured Cintra. For a time, many believed the only way the young knight would leave was via the scaffold. Lucky for him, a day would come when he was needed again. Being one of the few people who knew what Ciri looked like, the Vicovaran had seemingly made himself indispensable. And so, Emir granted him an opportunity he couldn't refuse. Recent intelligence reports indicated that Ciri had been spotted on the Isle of Thanedd. In exchange for his freedom, Cahir was to lead a commando of Scoia'tael and infiltrate the isle via boat. Once there, his assignment, exactly as it had been in Cintra, was to find and capture the princess and bring her back to Nilfgaard. But this time, he would have more than just swords and arrows at his back. It just so happened that the Conclave of Mages was to be held on Thanedd that very same night. And unbeknownst to many of the Northerners, there were turncoats among them who'd already pledged themselves to the Empire, and they were well prepared to spring Emir's trap. In time, the events that transpired on the Isle would go down in history as the Thanedd Coup, a violent betrayal that was partially responsible for the coming of the Second Northern War. When Cahir finally ran into the princess that night, it was nothing like their first encounter. Ciri, as it turned out, was no longer an incapable little girl, but one who had been trained by the Witchers of Cahir Mawr. The fear that once gripped her during the Slaughter of Cintra had been replaced with a savage fury. A fury which she showed Cahir the moment he tried to take her. Blow after blow, Cahir was beaten down. until it seemed as though it would be the end. Yet, when met with the opportunity to finish the Vic of Arran off, Ciri did not strike. At that moment, the Black Knight of Cintra who had tormented her dreams had been replaced by a boy with a face full of fear. In a way, Cahir as he once was had been slain. Only a terrified young man remained. No longer wanting to kill the Vic of Arran, the girl fled before a detachment of Scoia'tael arrived. As they tried to help their fallen comrade back to his feet, however, they were cut down by a stranger until not a single elf remained. When Cahir opened his blood-soaked eyes, a white-haired witcher by the name of Geralt of Rivia stood over him. Well aware of the boy's pursuit to find Ciri, he was more than ready to finish what the young witcheress had started. The girl, you must understand, was like a daughter to him, and it was only because Cahir had gotten her out of Cintra that the witcher left him to die on his own. Though no longer in any condition to go after Ciri, death would not find the Vic of Arran on Thanedd, as before the evening came to a close, Cahir was rescued by an elf known as Isengrim, one of the Scoia'tael commanders who had sailed with him to the Isle. While Cahir owed him his life, Isengrim had only saved him to cover Nilfgaard's tracks, and the young knight only remained a free man in his company until the day eventually came when the elf received secret orders from a Nilfgaardian spy. For having failed a second time to abduct Ciri, Emhyr had branded Cahir as a traitor and demanded his capture. Again, the boy's father tried all that he could to save him, even going so far as to contact a sorceress relative by the name of Asirvar Onahid for help. But he never would see his son again. When the Emperor's orders reached the Commando, Isengrim had Cahir tied up and placed on a cart for transport. For the better part of a month, such remained his fate as he was passed off to a pair of hawkers and hauled south to an agreed location. It was there that the knight would have fallen into Nilfgaardian hands. Fortunately for him, his captors were accidentally intercepted by a trio of unlikely saviors along the way. More specifically, the witcher Geralt, the bard Dandelion, and the archer known as Milva. While pretending to be elves looking to buy supplies, the party was caught in the middle of a deal gone wrong between the hawkers and a group of Nilfgaardians looking to buy the prisoner. It was a vicious scrap, yet by the time the dust settled, only the trio was left standing. When they found Cahir, the witcher had half a mind to leave him there to die, exactly as he had done on Thanedd. But thanks to Dandelion's sympathetic behest, Geralt would set the knight free on one condition. If they ever met again, he would kill him. Any sane person would have heeded the witcher's warning, yet Cahir was determined to follow. You see, after his last encounter with Ciri, something inside him had changed. He had seen the girl constantly in his dreams, only, rather than a skinny child, she appeared to him as a beautiful woman. As odd as it may seem, he ended up falling in love with her. Now the knight could never marry the princess himself. He knew that. But if she were to become the wife of the Emperor, as Emhyr wanted, he could, at the very least, see her every now and again. It occurred to him that joining Geralt was his best chance at making that dream a reality, and not but a few days passed before he found the Witcher again. In a fit of what could only be described as anger and frustration, Geralt ordered Cahir to draw his sword and fight. His previous warning was no jest. But the young knight simply refused, and made it clear he merely wanted to help the Witcher find Ciri. Still thinking him an enemy, Geralt had no intention of listening to such nonsense, and neither did Milva, who, after realizing the Vic of Arran could never keep up with them on foot, threatened to put an arrow in the belly of Cahir's horse. The knight had no other option but to flee. Yet once Cahir was out of sight, he continued to follow all the same, only now from a distance. As the knight tracked the riders going east, he watched as they joined up with a group of dwarves leading a handful of refugees, and even acted as a sort of rear guard whenever they would run into trouble. Needless to say, it wasn't long before the company learned of Cahir's presence, but given his newfound usefulness, they began to see him less and less as an enemy. It was a belief that would be held strongest by Milva the night they stopped at a refugee camp along the western bank of the Cholta River. The group had only managed to rest there for a short while before the camp was turned into a battleground by Nilfgaardian and Temerian forces. As pandemonium took over the camp's inhabitants, the Witcher and his friends were scattered. Milva, now on her own, tried to stop a group of peasants from fleeing with their horses, but she was ultimately overpowered. Out of everyone, it was the Vic of Varan of all people who came to her rescue. Though still wary of the young knight's true intentions, the archer was also grateful for his help. Not long after that, the two of them ran into Regis, a barber surgeon who the Witcher's company had recently befriended in Fen Karn. The dwarves, on the other hand, were nowhere to be seen, and Geralt and Dandelion, having been mistaken for Nilfgaardian spies, were dragged to a nearby military outpost for questioning. Conveniently for them, Regis knew exactly where they had disappeared to, and before dawn, he even managed to help them escape. As it turned out, the barber surgeon was capable of far more than he let on. It was for that reason, though, that when at last they were all together again, it was Regis whom the Witcher first turned his attention to, and not Cahir. Despite having saved them, the barber surgeon had revealed himself to be a higher vampire, one of the continent's most deadly monsters. Believing him too dangerous to keep around, the Witcher asked the vampire to leave, a request which Regis gracefully obliged. Yet when Geralt tried to do the same to Cahir, Milva stood in his way. After all, the knight had not only saved her, but their horses as well, Geralt's mare Roach included. As much as it pained him, the Witcher had no choice but to accept the Vic of Varan into his company, though his cooperative nature would only last for so long. After crossing over the Aina into Sodden, Geralt insisted that he was continuing his search for Ciri alone. It was clear that he was having one of his moods, but this time, the entire group put their foot down, including Regis, who had appeared out of thin air to finish treating one of Dandelion's wounds. With all of them having had enough of the Witcher's brooding, they declared that they would find Ciri together. Geralt had been overruled. Clueless as to where Ciri wound up following the events on Thanedd, the Hansa set their sights on the Druid Circle in Cedd Du. It turned out Regis had a friend there who he believed could help pinpoint the girl's location. The only problem was that they would have to pass through Iskith if they wanted to get there without wandering into enemy territory. For those who have never had the misfortune of visiting, Iskith is some 30 square miles of toxic swamps and marshes, and it's not just frogs and beavers that live there either. The wetland is inhabited by all manner of monsters, many of which not even Witchers have managed to classify. To make matters worse, Milva, they had just discovered, was 10 weeks pregnant. While she had managed to hide it for some time, the vampire eventually figured out what was wrong. In her compromised condition, they had to make a choice. But with no intention of putting their female companion in danger, the men of the party elected to take the long way around. Though, even that would bring more trouble than they had hoped. When they attempted to cross the Aruga River via ferry, the group was caught in the crossfire between the guerrilla forces of Queen Meve and a detachment of Nilfgaardians. With nowhere else to go, the current took them in the direction of the Red Port, a Nilfgaardian-held garrison on the edge of the river. And before they knew it, they were stuck at the base of a bridge. With the skirmish still raging all around them, the ferry driver was killed by an arbalist, and their horses lost overboard. Then there was Milva. It seemed as though she too had been struck by a crossbow bolt, but the reality was much darker than that. She had miscarried. Recognizing that the Lyrians were quickly losing ground overhead, Geralt and Cahir needed to make a stand if they were to save their friend. Without hesitation, the two sprung into action atop the bridge, trying their best to redirect the fleeing troops. Though Cahir had led soldiers before, this would be the first time he'd ever done so against his own countrymen. Nevertheless, it was on that bridge that he proved himself. With a powerful speech, the young knight rallied the panicked Illyrians back into the fight. Now led by the Witcher and the former Nilfgaardian, they fought tooth and nail, until the Black Ones were ultimately forced to withdraw into the woods, and so ended the battle for the bridge. For their spontaneous act of bravery, Cahir and Geralt were heralded as heroes by Meve and her soldiers, and for 6 days, they stayed with the Lyrians as Milva recovered, until eventually, the army stopped marching east. Conceding they would no longer be heading in the direction of the Druids, the group decided to leave Meve's ranks under the cover of darkness, stealing 4 horses and a mule in the process. The Vic of Varan, who had now fought with and deserted armies on each side of the war, had also earned himself a death sentence from both. Understandably wanting to separate themselves from their new foes as quickly as possible, the Hansa made their way east along the southern bank of the Oruga. Though they'd more or less managed to escape the war, it was there in the river country that they came across an unfortunate bit of news. According to a resident beekeeper, the Druids had recently been driven out of their home by the Nilfgaardians, and had moved their circle to the North Case, a tract of land some 60 miles south. It was a strange coincidence to be sure, especially since, that following morning, the clearing was filled with people wanting the Witcher's Hansa to escort them in that same direction, to the town of Riedbrunn. Truth be told, the beekeeper had no idea where the Druids had really gone. It was hardly a secret. But the terrain around the North Case seemed like as promising a place as any. So the company, not having any better leads, gave in to the settlers' proposal. It was a good thing, too, because when they finally reached Riedbrunn some 5 days later, they received a tip that the Druids of Cedd had actually made their way into Toussaint via the Sans Retour Valley. While stocking up on supplies, they also learned from the governor of Riedbrunn, and a captured bandit by the name of Angoulême, that a certain half-elf and a gang led by a man called the Nightingale planned to ambush them in the town of Belhaven. With the governor wanting the bandits dealt with, and the Hansa needing to pass through the area to reach the Druids, they agreed that they would take care of the gang, and even went so far as to purchase Angoulême's freedom, as thanks for her warning them about the alleged attack. While no longer on good terms with the Nightingale herself, the girl had once been a member of his crew, and would prove useful in tracking him down. There was just one issue that needed sorting out before they left. You see, it seemed rather impossible to Geralt that the half-elf could have known their location, or that they would pass through Belhaven. Unless, of course, someone had betrayed them. Naturally, the blame fell on Cahir. Yet already having proven his loyalty multiple times, the knight refused to be insulted in such a manner, and a brawl ensued between himself and the Witcher. A brawl which ended with the both of them being whipped by a belt held by Milva. It was the last time Cahir and Geralt would ever fight. In truth, the half-elf, also known as Shrew, had been working for a powerful mage named Vilgefortz, who was trying to capture Ciri. Wanting to use Geralt as bait, he had cast a spell to magically pinpoint the Witcher's location. When the group deduced such might be the case, they decided that Dandelion, Regis, and Milva would ride to Toussaint and look for the Druids, while Geralt, Cahir, and Angoulême would head to Belhaven to track down the half-elf and his assassins. Outnumbered and without much to go on, it was no doubt a wretched plan. But there was a good chance Shrew knew something that could help them find Ciri, so they had to try. Having remembered seeing the reddish-brown dirt from Belhaven's iron mines on the Nightingale's boots, the quarry was the first place Angoulême suggested they look once they reached town. And to her credit, it didn't take long before they were questioned by some of his gang. Thinking on her feet, the clever lass told them that she and her new friends had already killed the Witcher, and wanted to speak to Shrew directly about the promised bounty. It was a compelling attempt, but one that ultimately fell short of the desired effect, and a fight between the two sides was quick to unravel. At any rate, with Cahir's help and the Witcher still very much alive, mere seconds passed before every one of the bandits lay dead on the ground. Uncoincidentally, it was then that 3 men emerged from a nearby building, and called out to the trio to come inside for a chat. The one in the middle was the half-elf. It seemed he'd overheard their conversation about Geralt's bounty, and had taken to their bluff. Yet once inside, the half-elf sprung a trap of his own as he put a blade to Angoulême's throat. It turned out he had recognized the Witcher. In an unexpected turn of events, however, the stalemate that followed was quickly broken up by a squad of soldiers who had come from outside. It felt like a lucky break, but in actuality, the Black Ones were no less criminal than the half-elf standing in front of them. Not only did the Nightingale number among their posse, but it just so happened that the corrupt soldiers had been running a lucrative business with them in Belhaven. The gang's initial plan was to find some rope in a sturdy tree, but as soon as they dragged the trio outside to hang, they were ambushed by a mob of freedom fighters. The scales had tipped once again. Amidst the chaos, Cahir and the others did their best to stop Shrew and the Nightingale from escaping, but nothing good came of it. Aside from the fact that their targets managed to flee town, Cahir had been struck in the head by a throwing axe. What was once part of his forehead was now loose skin that revealed flesh and bone. Even so, the trio chased after the remnants of the gang for as long as they could. But with Geralt's horse dead from exhaustion, and the Vicovaren in no condition to ride, they didn't get very far. Unable to press on as a group, Angoulême was sent ahead to warn the others, while Geralt stayed behind with Cahir. To remain out of sight, the pair kept to the woods until they found a cave to sleep in. They didn't plan on lingering past the morning, but with Cahir having developed a nasty fever, they were forced to stay there for a few days as the knight regained his strength. It was during that period that the two finally came to understand each other and their shared connection to Ciri, and by the time they left, one might have even called them friends. After getting back on the main road, the first person they ran into was Regis, who'd been waiting for them near the base of Mount Gorgon. The others, having already been warned by Angoulême, had crossed into Toussaint and were under the protection of the Druid Circle in the sacred grove of Cedd Myrkfid. In the end, the nature lovers proved not much use with regard to locating Ciri, nor did Shrew or the Nightingale, who'd recently gotten themselves captured by the Druid Circle. Having cut down a number of their kin in cold blood, the Fluminica in charge simply couldn't allow the bandits to live any longer, and before the Hans had any time to question them, the nature lovers had the half-elf and his assassins burned alive in a giant wicker cage. All out of leads and in need of some rest, the group made their way to the city of Beauclair, and it was there they stayed, for months in fact, as the duchy's pleasures got the better of them. That was until the day eventually came when the Witcher stumbled upon a crucial bit of information. During a seemingly random contract, he'd managed to eavesdrop on a secret meeting between Nilfgaardian aristocrats conspiring against the Emperor. It was from them that he learned that Vilgefortz was hiding in Stygga Castle, the former home of the School of the Cat. If there was any chance of finding Ciri, it was there. When at long last they finally left Toussaint, their party was only 5 in number. Dandelion, having rekindled his relationship with the Duchess, had chosen to stay, though he did what he could to ensure they had ample coin for the journey ahead. Taking the Malheur Pass through the mountains, the Hansa rode west for over 1,000 miles, until they reached the Sorcerer's Castle in Ebbing. Once inside, Cahir and the others fought their way through the fortress in search of any sign of Ciri. At first, it seemed not a force in the world could stop them, yet one by one, they each began to fall. The first to go was Milva, who gave her life defending her companions from enemy archers. Then came Regis, who, after attempting to save Geralt from the Sorcerer's wrath, was burnt to a crisp. At the same time, Cahir and Angoulême, now split up from the others, had stumbled upon Ciri, who had just barely managed to escape the renowned bounty hunter known as Leo Bonhart before running into a handful of mercenaries. Without a second thought, the two fought with all they had left to defend the girl they had come so far to find. But by the time they beat the mercenaries back, the fish-eyed bounty hunter had emerged again. With Angoulême now badly wounded, Cahir ordered the girls to run as he held off Leo Bonhart for as long as he could. Legend has it that the young knight fought bravely, to the bitter end, but the grizzled bounty hunter was simply too fast and too strong, and a single ill-timed parry was all it took for the professional killer to cut the boy from temple to cheek. Though it was in those castle walls that Cahir would ultimately breathe his last, he did so not as the Nilfgaardian who had haunted Ciri's dreams, but as the hero from Vicovaro who had come to her defense. But whatever became of the ashen-haired princess, and why was she so special to Leo Bonhart and the One-Eyed Sorcerer? Well, my friends, that is a tale for another time.